December 1944, a dimly lit command post near Bastogne, Belgium outside. The freezing fog of the Ardennes blankets a landscape torn by artillery craters. Inside, ice forms on the window panes, while a lone kerosene lamp flickers against the damp stone walls. A messenger wearing a snow-dusted American overcoat and a muddy helmet steps through the doorway. He drops a heavy leather satchel onto a wooden table. He pulls out an official military order, fresh from the typewriter, stamped with the official division crest and signed by the commanding general. The paper orders an immediate 5-mile retreat from a vital road junction. If the men obey, the entire front line cracks open. General George S. Patton, Jr. will discover this precise deception within 24 hours, and his response will redefine how the American Army measures loyalty and identifies an enemy hiding in plain sight. This is the story of what a major did when he noticed the messenger's boots were wrong and stopped a fake withdrawal order. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the split second that rewrites a soldier's life. Major Luis Ramirez was 33 years old. He came from San Antonio, Texas, where the dry heat and wide plains shaped his early years. He left behind a small family grocery store and a young wife when the draft call arrived. Before arriving in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, Ramirez had already survived the heavy hedgerow fighting in Normandy and the bloody crossings of the Saar River. He had lost his closest childhood friend to a mortar burst outside Metz, a loss that carved deep lines around his eyes and taught him never to take a single detail for granted on the front line. Now, as the commander of an isolated infantry battalion under the Third Army, every life in the sector depended on his absolute vigilance. He sat behind a makeshift desk, checking his watch, waiting for a routine radio confirmation that never came. The man who called himself Corporal Stevens was actually a 26-year-old German sergeant named Heinz Werner, born in Berlin. Werner was a fanatical believer in the total victory of the Reich, raised on the strict doctrine that the end always justified the means. He spoke flawless English, polished by 3 years of university study before the outbreak of the war. Because of his perfect accent, Otto Skorzeny selected him for a special, highly classified infiltration brigade. Werner enjoyed immense privilege within his special unit, including tailored American wool uniforms, captured American cigarettes, and forged identification papers that could fool almost any checkpoint. He believed the Americans were soft, undisciplined, and easily tricked by a confident presentation. He stood in the command post, his posture relaxed, waiting for the American major to sign the order that would ruin the entire regional defense. By the middle of December 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had ground to a sudden and frozen halt. The Supreme Command believed the German army was entirely broken, capable only of a desperate defensive struggle inside their own borders. This overconfidence created a dangerous vulnerability along the densely forested Ardennes sector, where thinly stretched American divisions held massive front lines with minimal reserves. The German High Command secretly massed hundreds of thousands of fresh troops and heavy armor for a massive counteroffensive, aiming to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. To maximize the panic, they launched Operation Greif, a covert mission using English-speaking soldiers to infiltrate behind the lines and sow total chaos. In the opening days of this massive assault, the American rear areas descended into absolute paranoia. Roads were misdirected, communication lines were cut, and rumors spread like wildfire through every isolated outpost. Officers in many sectors had let minor discrepancies slide, chalking up unusual behavior or strange paperwork to the general madness of a sudden retreat. The sheer speed of the German breakthrough meant that genuine units were constantly displaced, making it incredibly easy for a well-rehearsed imposter to walk into a command post and deliver catastrophic false instructions. Entire platoons abandoned strategic positions simply because a man in an American Jeep told them the flank had collapsed. The line between a successful defense and a total rout came down to whether individual commanders trusted their training or gave into the spreading fear. The entire Ardennes campaign hung in a delicate balance as the German infiltrators moved deeper into the American lines, subverting the very structure of military command. Major Ramirez stared at the document on his desk, his eyes tracking the signature of the division commander. Corporal Stevens stood perfectly still, his helmet tucked under his left arm, his uniform remarkably pristine for a man who claimed to have ridden a motorcycle through 5 miles of muddy, shell-torn terrain. Ramirez looked up from the paper and asked where the division commander had held his morning briefing. Stevens answered immediately, naming the precise coordinates of the forward headquarters, and mentioning that the general was drinking black coffee from a dented tin cup. Ramirez nodded slowly, acknowledging that the detail matched the general's usual habits, but noted that division always verified a withdrawal order over the field phone before sending a runner. Stevens shook his head, explaining that a sudden German artillery barrage had severed the communications wire 10 minutes before he departed, forcing the staff to rely on written messages. Ramirez leaned forward, asking how the crossroads at the eastern ridge looked when Stevens drove past. Stevens reported that the road was entirely clear, though 3 burnt-out trucks blocked the northern ditch. Ramirez stood up, walking around the wooden desk, his boots clicking softly against the concrete floor as he took a pack of matches from his pocket. He stopped 2 feet away from the messenger, asking if the division quartermaster had finally received the new shipment of winter overcoats from the supply depots in Paris. Stevens smiled confidently, stating that his own coat was part of that very shipment, issued just 3 days ago to ensure the couriers stayed warm during the night runs. Ramirez dropped his gaze, his eyes locking onto the heavy leather boots the messenger wore, noting the distinct pattern of metal hobnails hammered into the soles instead of the standard American rubber. He looked back into the man's eyes, asking why a corporal from Texas would be wearing German-issue service boots. Stevens hesitated for a fraction of a second, his posture stiffening as he stated that he had taken them off a dead German officer because his own boots had rotted through from the trench foot. Ramirez unbuttoned his holster, stating that American soldiers do not wear hobnails because the sound gives away their position in the dark, and real Texas boys do not use British phrasing like university or petrol when they speak to a superior officer. Stevens realized the deception had completely failed, his face hardening as he reached into his overcoat for a concealed Walther pistol. Before his fingers could grasp the grip, the battalion executive officer lunged across the table, tackling the infiltrator to the ground and pinning his arms behind his back. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled directly up to the entrance of the battalion command post, its tires crunching heavily over the frozen Belgian mud. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the dull winter light, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested securely against his thighs. Every officer and clerk in the room snapped to absolute attention, their breath hanging in the cold air as the general stepped inside. Without saying a word, Patton studied the prisoner. He looked at the tailored wool uniform, then down at the heavy German footwear. He asked the captured sergeant how long he had been speaking English. Werner replied that he had spoken it since his youth, adding that he had studied the language at a prestigious academy before the war. Patton asked if the German High Command truly believed that changing a pair of trousers could transform a servant of the Reich into an honorable soldier. Werner looked up, stating that war was a matter of strategy, and his mission was simply to carry out his orders to ensure the ultimate victory of his country. Patton asked if the sergeant realized that wearing the uniform of his enemy stripped him of all protections under the laws of land warfare. Werner remained silent, adjusting his posture slightly, but refusing to look away. Patton stepped closer, his voice low and precise. He stated that the German military had spent years claiming an inherent cultural and tactical superiority over the rest of the world. Yet, when faced with total defeat on the Western Front, that same proud army had resorted to hiding behind forged signatures and stolen jackets. They had sent their finest university-educated men into the woods to act as thieves and tricksters, hoping a piece of paper could accomplish what their panzers could no longer manage. He pointed down at the floor, noting that Major Ramirez had spent his entire life working for what he earned in a simple family grocery store in San Antonio. Ramirez had earned his rank through blood and mud at Normandy and the Saar River, relying on sharp eyes and absolute honesty to keep his men alive. The German sergeant had relied entirely on privilege, tailored wool, and a stolen identity to steal a victory he could not achieve on the battlefield. Patton delivered his choice. He stated that the prisoner could either sign a full confession detailing every checkpoint and route used by his infiltration brigade, or he could stand before a military tribunal within the hour. Either way, the general noted, a man who masquerades as an American soldier must accept the immediate and permanent consequences of his choice. Werner stared at the floor, his jaw clenched in absolute silence. The military tribunal convened in a nearby stone barn within 30 minutes of the general's departure. 3 senior officers sat behind a rough wooden plank supported by oil drums, their faces cast in deep shadow. The German sergeant stood tall before them, still dressed in the clean American wool overcoat that had failed to save his mission. The proceedings were brief, formal, and conducted with a cold efficiency that left no room for appeal or negotiation. The verdict was reached in less than 15 minutes under the provisions of the Hague Convention regarding spies caught operating behind enemy lines. The execution was carried out at dawn against the rear wall of the brick courtyard, in full view of the assembled battalion clerks and drivers. The morning air was bitter, filled with the sharp smell of burning diesel fuel from nearby trucks and the heavy scent of frozen mud. 2 military policemen bound Werner's wrists securely to a wooden post, while a lieutenant stepped forward to tie a dark cloth strip over his eyes. The firing squad, consisting of 8 infantrymen from the very battalion he had tried to deceive, stood in a neat line 20 paces away. They raised their rifles at the command, their movements synchronized and robotic in the early light. The sharp report of the volley echoed loudly off the stone buildings, and the German sergeant slumped forward against the ropes as the spectators watched in absolute silence. Major Ramirez returned to San Antonio after the war, his body intact, but his mind carrying the permanent weight of the Ardennes forests. He reopened his family grocery store on the west side of the city, working 6 days a week behind the counter and speaking quietly to his neighbors. He rarely mentioned Belgium, the snow, or the desperate winter of 1944 to his children, but he kept a single pair of standard-issue American rubber-soled boots on a shelf in his closet until his death in 1982. The object served as a silent reminder of the exact moment a single glance prevented a catastrophe. Heinz Werner did not survive the morning of his trial, buried in an unmarked grave near the edge of the Belgian courtyard, where his mission met its sudden end. His family in Berlin received no detailed record of his execution, only a brief notice listing him as missing in action during the winter offensive. The specialized infiltration unit he belonged to dissolved entirely within 3 weeks of the Ardennes counter-offensive. Its survivors captured or scattered across the collapsing Western Front as the Allied armies resumed their steady march toward the Rhine. Patton never included the specific details of the incident in his public briefings, preferring to let the news of the execution serve as a quiet warning throughout the sector. He kept a copy of the intelligence report locked in his desk, adding a single handwritten notation at the bottom of the final page before filing it away. His private papers later revealed his final thought on the matter, noting that an army can survive a shortage of fuel or ammunition, but it cannot survive a moment where a commander fails to trust his own eyes. Some historians have argued that Patton's immediate execution of the captured infiltrator was a harsh and hasty use of military authority, bypassed the standard channels of a formal court-martial, and risked creating a dangerous cycle of retaliation against American prisoners held in the rear areas. They suggest that keeping the German sergeant alive for a longer interrogation could have yielded valuable intelligence regarding the rest of Otto Skorzeni's special brigade. Others have argued the opposite, defending the general's actions as a vital and legally justified response to an unconventional threat that threatened to collapse the entire line. What is certain is that the sudden and public enforcement of the rules of warfare stabilized the sector, put an end to the spreading panic, and forced the German command to realize that their deceptive tactics would meet with immediate and fatal consequences. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have spared the infiltrator for an intelligence interrogation? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the split second that rewrites a soldier's life, make sure to subscribe.